Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com.
Hello and welcome to the show. If you're learning a foreign language, you're in the right place. This is the show that you need to give you your weekly dose of language learning, motivation, inspiration, answering your questions, and all things to do with that. So today we've got a great question, which is all about, the reason I like this question is because you know how there are things which it seems so simple and yet you just really don't know, and you think about it and you think about it and you just wish that someone would just tell you the answer. Just tell me what to do, that feeling. So let's get into it. It's from Greg and it's about Spanish.
Hey Ollie, this is Greg and I'm in Chicago in the United States. I'm learning Spanish. And here's my question. For a sort of international language like Spanish, and I think this applies equally to a lot of other major world languages like French or English, there are many different varieties. And so the Spanish of Spain versus Spanish of Mexico versus Spanish of Colombia or Argentina, each one has its own distinct characteristics, different pronunciation, different accents, different vocabulary, different expressions, even different grammar. Is it better for me as a learner to expose myself widely to all the different varieties of Spanish and to interact with speakers from many different countries that speak Spanish? Or is it better to sort of really get a solid grounding in one particular variety and just focus on that? Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Hey Greg, thank you so much for your question. I really like this question because I think I've got quite a unique perspective on this, because you're absolutely right about all these different varieties of Spanish, and yet I learned Spanish without ever having to kind of worry about this because it was all a very natural process for me. So I think I've got a pretty good perspective on it, and I'd like to sort of share that with you today in this answer. So I first started learning Spanish when I was living in France. My whole language learning story, you can check that out in episode 2, where I go through how I learned all of my languages. But I was 19 or 20 years old. I was living in Paris, learning French, and at a certain point I thought, well, let's try another language, and so I decided to learn Spanish. I learnt my first little bits of Spanish with my girlfriend at the time, who was Colombian French, and it's half and half, and so she would teach me little bits of Colombian Spanish, and I just learnt a few words and phrases and things like that. After that, I went for a trip to Spain. And I remember getting there and not understanding a word of what was going on, because Colombian Spanish and Spanish from Spain are totally different, particularly the accents, very, very different. And so that was a bit of a shock to the system. I then subsequently went back to London, and I met a guy who was from the Canary Islands, and so I learnt Spanish with him at that point. And this sort of became my most intensive Spanish experience, because we were really good friends, and we spent the best part of 2 years together speaking only Spanish, and so that's kind of how I cut my teeth with Spanish. So by this point, I'd already had exposure to Colombian Spanish, Spanish from Spain, then Spanish from the Canary Islands. A few years later, I actually then went to live in Argentina for 6 months, and again got there and didn't understand a word. A very different variety of Spanish. Again, a different accent, different grammar even, and it was tough at the beginning. But after 5-6 months, I got used to it, and it became fairly normal. I then went back to London and kind of then just started meeting Spanish people from all over the world, which is one of the great things about London. So I had this huge journey of learning all these different kinds of Spanish, but I'd never really thought about it, and there was nothing strategic about it. At the times when I had a problem, like when I first arrived in Argentina, I remember in particular, well, I just kind of dealt with it, and I just kind of got on with it, and I would speak and listen to what people were saying and eventually figure it out. So what I learned from that whole saga really was that flexibility is absolutely fine, and you will adapt to different varieties of Spanish as and when you need to. So I don't think it's quite as big an issue as it probably seems, because although, here I am talking about how I went to these different countries and I didn't understand a word. Well, if you're in the fortunate situation of actually going to one of these different countries, you'll learn when you get there, and you will adapt. And it might be tricky for the first week or so, but pretty quickly you figure out what's going on. So I think my main thing is that it's not to make too big a deal of it, because I think there are other things that are far more important, namely, actually getting to grips with studying Spanish on a regular basis and putting in the time with your textbook and having regular conversations. Those things, I think, by far outweigh the importance of which particular variety you want to learn. But if you want to get a bit more strategic about it, then I would say that as a principle, and this goes for anything, whether you're learning to cook or learning to swim or whatever, you learn more in general by going narrow and by going deep. So rather than trying to learn everything, choosing one specific narrow thing and becoming very good at that. So if you were learning to cook, for example, you might decide you wanted to become an expert at cooking pasta, for example, making fresh pasta. I don't know. Because I think when you go narrow and you go deep, then you get closer to these glimpses of mastery in a very specific area. And I think the fact that you get closer to mastery, even if it's only a very narrow thing, that raises your game overall. All right, so I think based on that principle, I would say that it's better for you to focus on one dialect, one variety, I'm not sure what the correct term is, one variety of Spanish above all. Because not only will you end up getting better at Spanish in general, but once you kind of reach a higher level in one of the varieties of Spanish, the rest of them are going to be much easier to understand. All right, if you're still at a lower level and you kind of have to go switch between Bolivian Spanish and Colombian Spanish and Spanish from Spain, because your level's low, you're going to struggle with all kinds of things. But if you can get to a higher level at with one dialect, you're going to be much more able to then switch between different varieties and pick them up very quickly. So that's what I'd say. And I think above all, there's really no particular advantage to going after a whole bunch of different varieties. I mean, you could say, well, I'll be better able to understand everybody. Yeah, that's true, but then you've still got to get to grips with the basic learning of the language. And the more you try to add on to that, and the more you try to kind of have all these what I call just-in-case scenarios, the less work you're actually going to do on the main objective, which is actually to learn Spanish. So I don't think there's any particular need or any particular advantage to going after all these different kinds of dialects. I mean, by all means, if you've got movies from Argentina and Colombia or whatever, then by all means, as you say, expose yourself to that variety of Spanish, listen to them. But in terms of your main aim, I'd say stick to one. But there's a caveat here, because it's all very well me theorizing and talking about principles and all of this. But I think when it comes to language learning, there are certain things which count more than anything else. So, Greg, if you're in a situation where you've got, say, friends from a particular background, say friends who speak a particular variety of Spanish, or you find yourself in certain communities or groups of people where more than one variety of Spanish is spoken, then that kind of opportunity to speak and to interact and to mingle with people who are using different varieties, that trumps everything. All right. So if you do find yourself in these kind of natural situations, whether it's with friends and colleagues or traveling or whatever, where you've got the opportunity to use these different varieties, then go with it. Absolutely. 100%. Don't deny yourself any particular opportunity because of the principle of learning one thing is better. Because that's ultimately how I learned. Okay, I went from place to place, situation to situation, and I just coped and I got on with it, and my Spanish ended up being much better and much stronger and more versatile as a result. So I hope that helps. I really like that question, so thanks for asking it. And if you'd like to ask me a question, then please do. You can head over to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask, and you can leave me a voicemail question there, just like Greg did. It's really easy. You can use your mobile phone, your computer, whatever. So you can use the microphone built in to leave me a question. You can also leave me a question in an iTunes review. So just go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/review, and that will send you over to iTunes, where you can leave a review for me, which I would really appreciate anyway. So if you haven't left me a review, why don't you go and do that? It just takes a second or two, and it would mean the world to me. It helps me reach other people who are also learning languages. Now, at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind based on the topic of the show. And I'm going to point you today to an article which involves lots of different people that were brought together and asked one very simple question, which was, where is the best place to learn Spanish in South America? So kind of related to today's question, you've got lots of different Spanish experts, travelers, bloggers, writers, who all answer this same question. They give their own personal perspective on where is the best place to learn Spanish in South America. So it's interesting to see what they come up with. And it's also interesting to see how much one country in particular dominates the list. So if you'd like to check that out, then head over to the show notes at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 23, and then I'll put a link to that post so you can check out where all these people think is the best place to learn Spanish in South America. You might be a bit surprised. So thanks, Greg, for your question. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT, and if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.